Hello, my name is Danielle Choi, and I currently serve as secretary for the state officer team of Maryland HOSA. And today, as part of the interview series, we are joined by a very special person, Patrick Bloniasz. Um, he is a current PhD candidate at Boston University studying computational neuroscience as a National Science Foundation funded graduate fellow. He holds a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and digital and computational studies with a minor in philosophy from Bowdoin College. Through his neuroscience work, he has developed expertise in point process modeling, spectral theory, and signal processing using point processes to explain biomarkers of propofol anesthesia-induced unconsciousness in humans, as well as monkeys. In addition, he has conducted NIH-funded research on theta oscillations and episodic memory at Bowdoin College. Patrick also serves as the president of the board of the nonprofit Simply Neuroscience and research collaborator at New York University's Mind Hive program, where he mentors high school students engaging in community science projects. He not only contributes to the scientific community through his advanced research, but also actively impacts communities through his volunteer work and mentorship.
Hey. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So I guess just to get started, my very first question for you is what are you currently studying and what does an average day look like?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the second part of the question. So an average day can vary quite a bit depending on what your main research project is, the style of the lab that you're in, and if you're in a PhD, what stage of your PhD are you in? So maybe just generically for folks who are interested looking at pursuing a doctorate in STEM, typically the first couple of years are focused on courses where you'll take 2 to 3 courses at a time for each semester. And then outside, you'll have one of two things going on. One, you might be a teaching assistant for a large graduate class or a master's level class where often you'll grade, you'll offer office hours, sometimes you'll help run the lab, but it's a way to sort of gain educational experience in an academic setting. The other thing that you'll primarily spend your time on is research. So often in your first year, you'll rotate through different labs depending on the program, and that's to get introduced to the sort of principal investigators that you might work with at the university. And in those rotations, you'll learn a lot of skills, often from scratch. And those can range anywhere from like 6 weeks to a semester long. Once you match with a lab, which is usually done in your at the end of your first year or early second year, you'll start your primary thesis work. Now, not everything you do ends up going in your dissertation. And so sometimes people will spend quite a bit of time collecting data, whether it's for their project or other projects in the lab, learning the standard analyses, and then going from there. Then you start to settle into what a traditional scientific life looks like. So now, since I'm much later in my PhD, I'm in my fourth year. My day is pretty similar day to day, even though it's broken up into a bunch of different tasks. So I'll start my morning by reading a couple of different scientific papers. So in my field, even though it's super niche, tons of papers come out every week, and so you need to try to keep up with those. So I set up a bunch of Google alerts for different papers with keywords that are published every week. And so I can keep a pulse on those. Then I move into sort of a more computational part of my work where I'll just work on my code base. This might be refactoring code, debugging things that have sort of accumulated over time. And then for me personally, I spend later in my afternoon focused on the most important parts of the project, which are like conducting the analyses, writing papers, or preparing different talks and presentations. So it's always going to be variable and different. Sometimes you're just doing a lot of coding and nothing else. Sometimes you're doing just a lot of data collection and nothing else. But it all depends on sort of your stage, if you will. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. But it's a cool job if you ever want to not be working on like the same exact thing and you want a bunch of varied tasks throughout the day.
Wow, that sounds really cool. Um, I guess my second question is kind of talking about how career journeys are definitely they're not necessarily linear, and that's just an inevitable part of life. So, what were some reasons that made you pursue computational neuroscience, and have you ever faced any challenges during your career pathway?
Yeah, so a whole bunch of challenges, some unique to me, some just a product of the field. So I would say, like broadly, for folks who are interested in the career of scientists or say like a researcher in the health sciences, um, oftentimes your path is determined not only by like resources that are available to you at like different stages throughout your career, but also just like the overall emphasis of like where a given field is going. So, for example, I started in undergrad doing a whole bunch of different research projects because I knew I was interested in neuroscience, but I kind of had to go where the opportunities were. So right off the bat, I wanted to do research in episodic memory in humans, but the lab that I wanted to work with wasn't accepting anyone at the time. And even though it was well funded, like they had full-time staff at the time when I was applying. So I started off working on neuromodulation in lobsters, which was like completely different from what I was interested in. But it ended up being very, very helpful because I sort of learned to work at very small network scales. So I was just studying 9 cells, five of them you can't see. And like from there, I learned how to code. So that was my first time doing like MATLAB coding. Now I use Python, but that was like an introduction for me. That was my first time using math, like in a research context. And the surgeries were pretty difficult. Um, while I was working in that lab, COVID-19 happened. And so that was something that was unforeseen and changed my career trajectory a ton. So I originally wanted to be like a physician, and if I wanted to do sort of wet lab research, I was in like the perfect place to like learn surgeries, collect data, and things along those lines. Because of COVID, we had to go home, and I still needed to complete the project that I was funded to do. And so I switched to a computational only project for part of the summer, where I learned how to do theoretical modeling with the support of a mathematician at my undergrad and my advisor, who was an electrophysiologist at the time. And because the next couple of years, like we weren't really able to get into lab spaces and lab spaces were limited, those were reserved for folks who were older than me and were like focusing on their honors theses. And so I had to do a lot of computational work. And so I ended up accruing a ton of time just by circumstance where I would move around to different labs doing computational work. So I did some cricket genomic work on neuronal regeneration, where if you like chop off the ear, which is sounds really gruesome, but like crickets can grow them back. And so we were studying the genes underneath how that happens. And then finally, in my senior year, I was able to return to my human memory work. And I now had all these different skills where I was like computationally proficient in a bunch of areas. And so my thesis ended up being primarily computational, even though I was doing work with human data. So long story short, um, didn't get into the lab I wanted to right away. So I needed to pivot, find another opportunity. Things going on out in the world changed how my work could look. So kind of adapted and moved in a different direction. And then by the time I applied for PhDs, I had this experience with all the computational side of things, but I could also make the case that I had experience working across spatial scales, where I worked with like 9 cells in lobsters, and then I moved to crickets, and I worked with a whole bunch of different genes across larger swaths of tissue. And then with humans, I worked across like hundreds of thousands of cells in a particular area of cortex. So I could make the case that I would be the perfect person to take a project that would bridge information across those spatial scales. And so my PhD now, even though I study anesthesia, is focused on bridging electrophysiological data across spatial scales. So the monkey and human work is like a direct application of these skills that I kind of got by accident. So I guess like maybe for folks who are interested in pursuing like computational neuroscience, right? Like you can get into that space by taking courses in like computer science, mathematics, obviously biology. But there's no one way to get to that path. Like it could be randomly falling on different projects that happen to be more computational, or randomly applying to labs that might not be a computational neuroscience lab, but might have a component where you can learn and kind of take on those responsibilities. And when you get to PhD level and higher, um, most people have a computational bend. And so the style of computational neuroscience you might do um, depends on sort of like the animal you work with or the people that you work with and the problem you're trying to solve. So for some people, it's just running algorithms. For other people, it's creating new math. Um, some people just make software. So it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. No one way to get in. But yeah, I think that's probably all I'll say for that.
Oh, wow. When you were talking about Python, that definitely reminded me of how in my freshman year I took like an introduction to neuros or computer science class. And one of the first languages you learned was Python. And it really is like an easy language to learn. So it kind of became one of my hobbies. So that kind of ties into the next question. So were there like any hobbies of yours besides like coding that helped you as you navigate your journey in like academic research?
Yeah, so I would say like these aren't necessarily hobbies per se, but just like other interests. So I've always been fascinated by philosophy and like social science, and so I do a lot of like educational work. Some of it you mentioned at the top of the interview. But that's always been the case where like even when I was back in high school, I would like make these sort of like Vox style explainer videos. And that turned into making tutorials on topics that I was really interested in. And at the time, early in undergrad, oftentimes before I would make the tutorial, it would be like teaching myself the actual thing, and I would learn the thing by teaching other people. Um, and so that ended up being really helpful because over time, like I would just accrue more and more knowledge of things in my field. And I think that professionally was helpful because anytime someone needed something, they would sort of like reach out for support. And so I kind of became an important member of the team just by like being interested in different things that I wanted to explore. I think like other hobbies, I was really interested in, this is kind of niche, but so I was like in choir and like did a bunch of music groups and stuff like that. And so I was very used to performing. And so now in a professional setting, like I'm very comfortable with like public speaking and controlling my voice at different volumes. Um, and like kind of having eyes on you, just because most presentations, you're like the center of attention. It's not about you, it's about the content. So you kind of have to minimize the amount of things that you do as a speaker to distract other people so that they can get the information. And then I think like practically speaking, like I teach, so I usually will teach classes of around like 50 to 55 people at a time. It's a pretty big lecture hall. It's not enormous, but big enough where, um, there's a lot of people. And so being able to get up there and lecture like 2 hours at a time without, being anxious or something like that can be really helpful. So I think those are probably a couple of them. Um, on your note about coding, like I think anyone who's interested in getting into neuroscience, whether it's computational or not, or even biology to that extent, should probably spend some time learning to code either with Python or another open access software such as like R or Julia. We've kind of moved in a direction as a field where even if you're not computational, like you always need to implement your own analyses and generate your own figures. Um, and things are just getting so complicated where it's difficult to do those in traditional, like with traditional methods like Excel or Prism is a common one, or SPSS is something that a lot of people in psychology learn. But yeah, totally would recommend that. But yeah, a lot of people have random hobbies that have turned into like really core facets of their career. And that's not what a hobby is for per se, but it is kind of nice when, there's an aspect of it that you love that sneaks its way into your everyday and you get to do it every day.
I guess kind of tying into like the research that you're currently doing. So what's really cool about HOSA is that they offer a lot of different competitive events. Because a lot of the students who are a part of HOSA, they have a very diverse range of interests. So one of the competitive events is actually a research poster, which I did during my freshman year. And so I was wondering, have you ever created like a research poster before for your academic research? And if so, what was like the process kind of like?
Yeah, so definitely completed a research poster, and it's a good thing to do. So maybe I'll just preface by saying in scientific research, whether you're in industry or in academia, the sort of artifacts that you create as part of your job kind of fall into a hierarchy. So there's like research papers, which are like peer reviewed, they're larger, they have many people involved. Oftentimes they'll take years to complete. So, like the last paper that just was published took about 2 years for me. Um, so that's like definitely the most. The second one is like the poster. And so the poster will often be like components of things that actually go into the paper. So it might be like a section of a result or like communicating the method that you use in the paper or sharing the initial data that you collected. And it's a great way to find or get feedback from people out in the field. But it's also like a great way to advertise the work so that people know it's coming. So usually by the time papers are published, almost everyone who needs to know about the paper knows about it. Um, and it's there's been so many eyes on it before. Um, the other thing, I'll get to the research poster in a second, but the other thing that's good about presenting research at conferences is like the networking aspect of it. And so oftentimes if you're at a particular stage of your career, so say you're like later on in your undergraduate career, um, near the end of your PhD or near the end of a postdoc, you'll find the person at the appropriate level and see if they're like hiring new positions. So a lot of the folks who I know who got a job out of undergrad to do research for a couple of years before either going to medical school or graduate school, found them through conferences. And even though you're not going to like obviously get the job on the spot there, it's helpful to like put a face to a name so that when they're reviewing applications, they're familiar with your work, your demeanor, and things along those lines. So the process for making a poster, usually we make the figures first and we chunk figures as a function of like results. So if we are, taking a certain aspect of our larger project that we want to communicate, so say introducing a new method, we'll try to sketch out like in a sentence, like what is the result we're trying to communicate, and then we'll spend a ton of time iterating on figures to make sure they actually will communicate that story without having someone around. So like if I wasn't at the poster and someone just walked up to it, they would be able to read that label, look down at the figure and know what they're looking at. Um, that's really difficult to do, especially like in niche areas. And so not only do we do our best to keep iterating on it, improve it, but we try to get feedback from people before it actually goes on the poster and we print. And that can look a lot of different ways. Sometimes we'll reach out to our collaborators and give lab presentations on it. I did that before my last conference. I had a number of them from more mathematically oriented people to more biology oriented people. Um, and then also giving that talk to people who have no idea what you're doing, but are trained in your field. And so that those folks are really, really invaluable. From there, then the rest of the figure or the rest of the poster kind of falls into place where you'll usually have a template, either one that your institution gives you. So for me at Boston University, we have a couple of different styles that we'll do, and there's like regulations around um, how you can use the logo and stuff like that. So you kind of have to follow those. But the centerpiece of the poster is always the figures. And then we'll fill in additional context where needed. So we'll have an abstract in the top left. Some people will just put bullet points. We try to put out like a narrative where someone can just read the narrative and then walk away if they're uninterested. And then at the bottom, we have little QR codes that link people to different information they might find useful. So the more technical aspects on the poster, so say like equations or the code we used, can be linked there. Sometimes it's supplemental figures that might help communicate the idea to people. Um, and in years past, I've tried to do like little tutorials where if I'm sharing a new method or sharing like a new software package, there'll be like little demo things that people can play around with on their phone just so they get a sense of like what you're doing. So I guess long story short, center on the results you're trying to communicate, come up with visuals that communicate that statement, and then get as much feedback as possible before you actually get to the conference.
I think that's like a lot of helpful advice. Because when I was making the research poster, I think I tend to go in like a very linear order. So I think it's like really helpful to know that you start with like the centerpiece first, like the figures, and then you build off of that. Um, so I guess my second to last question for you is, what has been like the most rewarding aspect of your research journey so far? And does your research have like any practical applications in healthcare?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So for the second part of it, I have always found it really important to make sure my work ties in one way or another to healthcare and making sure we improve the science that we're doing. So nowadays I work mostly on methods development, either like analysis based where you might like make new math or like a new mathematical framework, or I study tools that we use to try to make claims in healthcare, and give us tools to better understand like the limitations of those methods. Um, so for example, right, like there's a lot of folks who are interested in looking for like biomarkers of particular diseases. And so one way we've done that over the last like 10 to 15 years is you might have like an EEG headset, which are a bunch of these little electrodes that sit across the scalp and they'll record electrical information from the brain. Sometimes if you're, say, like a patient with epilepsy, you'll get electrodes on the surface of your brain. But in either case, we'll record information from that. And people will try to compare like recordings from someone with a particular disorder. So say like schizophrenia or early onset Alzheimer's compared to like a neurotypical control group. Um, and there's a whole bunch of different methods we use to try to analyze that data. And so what I've most recently been working on is like studying the most widely used approach to that, where they will sort of quantify certain relevant features in electrophysiology and compare like the groups. So for folks out there who are interested, it's called like spectral decomposition. It's a whole new area. It's come out probably in the last like 5, 6 years. But there are some issues with it, right? Where you can get some false positives, right? And so like my work right now is trying to develop like a new method that doesn't have that feature to it. And so how I've approached that is like working with the original authors of the tool who have done like a really good job building it up. And we're collaborating on creating something better. And then hopefully, once we're done, we'll be able to disseminate it to researchers who are doing that. So the way that improves healthcare is when you were trying to study or learn information to know like how groups are different or how you're going to diagnose someone before it's too late, or like how do you know if certain like biomarkers are sensitive to a treatment. We need to trust the tools that we are using to do that. So creating more interpretable, better behaving tools is essential for that. The other half of my work is like directly in healthcare. So I study propofol anesthesia. And right now, how we will typically study, or not study, but administer anesthesia is that we will have a whole bunch of different metrics that we use that are not necessarily tied to the thing we care about. So you have all your classic like respiration rate, blood pressure, things along those lines. There's a couple of different automatic indices that people will use. But you can have someone who appears to be unconscious, but like might actually be awake. And so that's an issue. And then we also, to avoid that, we'll give people a safe but high level of an anesthetic to make sure that they are not going to wake up during surgery. But that also has repercussions where recovery times are slow, which impacts the number of people who can receive surgery in a day because recovery time is higher. And it can also cause like all sorts of issues, like delirium and like nausea and stuff afterwards. So there's been a pretty long history of folks here in Boston who study ways we can monitor what the brain is doing when someone's under anesthesia so that we can know when the brain is not uh, feeling anything, so to speak. And we know when to sort of like cut off the amount of anesthesia that we're giving them. And ideally make it closed loop where in real time you can update the amount of dosage, like the dosage of the drug without having to have like guesswork. And so there's been a whole bunch of really interesting results in humans over the last couple of years of different ways you can track it reliably. So whether someone is sedated but could be woken up from painful stimuli, or if someone couldn't be woken up by painful stimuli. Um, so all those metrics kind of have been found, which is great. The downside is we don't actually know what the brain is doing during uh, those biomarkers. And so my job has been looking at those markers in monkeys, which are very similar, and getting a sense of like what is happening both in the thalamus and at cortex during those markers. So it's a way of like not only like replicating this result that we have in humans, but understanding what it actually is, so that in the future those findings that we've sort of created in the research world can find their ways into clinic. Um, there's a million other ways you can do medical research, but this is one where we actually found the biomarker in clinical populations, which is really exciting. Now we're working backwards to understand it before we then move forward and make a recommendation for like how to change practice.
And then I guess just to kind of tie off everything, my final question for you is, do you have like any advice for those who hope to pursue a career in research or like healthcare or even like just neuroscience in general?
Yeah, totally. So uh, I guess like the biggest piece of advice that I can give is like research is a really unpredictable field to go into, like regardless of what the subdiscipline is, whether it's engineering, biology, neuroscience, um, because it requires a lot of like upfront training. So you have to go through undergraduate, like sometimes a master's, sometimes years in between grad school and that master's. Then you have to do your PhD. Oftentimes you have to do additional training as like a postdoctoral fellow, which is a job you get paid for. PhD student, you do get paid for, but it's not like a lot of money. So there's a lot of upfront training, and the way funding usually is done in the United States comes from particular federal agencies. So I am funded through the National Science Foundation, which has been extraordinarily helpful, and they've been super, super supportive. I've also been funded through the National Institutes for Health, which is the NIH, and those are the vast majority of where dollars come from. Priorities change very quickly, so sometimes it's like politically oriented, which is common. That's happened for a long time. Sometimes it's just like national security, like interest priorities, where they'll pivot from like like infectious disease to chronic disease or whatever it might be. And because you have so much upfront cost and training in a particular way, you have a very narrow skill set that doesn't translate very well to different positions. And so when you're going through the training at any stage, so undergrad, graduate school, beyond, it's really good to sort of have a lot of varied interests in other fields. So sort of like collaborating with other folks outside your primary work, taking internships every once in a while, either to go to like industry or a different lab, visit another lab, can be really helpful. And then the other thing is to make sure you're keeping your network pretty wide, like at every different stage. So don't only just focus on like faculty members that are present to you, or don't only get like obsessed with one type of job. So like a academic scientist or like a scientist in industry, because the jobs in like the next like 5 to 10 years are going to look pretty different from when you're training. So that's like one piece of advice I would give. The other thing is it's not a sprint, so not everything has to be like in a hurry. A lot of the high schoolers that I work with and undergrads are really stressed about like publishing, and totally get the sentiment. It's really important to publish, and it's really helpful when you have publications. But it's one of those things where if you are in the science game for the long run, having publications that you can stand behind that are like rigorous and um, complete are way more valuable than like a bunch of like quick publications that you can get at like lower levels. So like in undergrad or something like that, because that record follows you everywhere. So, say, for example, you do a preprint and you put it up on Archive, which is a repository for putting papers. There's a DOI assigned to it, and that's going to be attached to your name no matter where you go, anywhere in the world. So, if you have like a job um, lined up and someone is reviewing your publication record, and there's something that was like inaccurate that you didn't correct when you were early in high school or like something along those lines, they're going to like look at that and like wonder about your judgment, even though it happened like a long time ago. So I guess like the advice there is don't be in a rush, take your time, learn the things you need to learn, listen to your mentors. And then publish when everyone is involved is really comfortable with the outcome of the work, and that will serve you much better than trying to like rush out as much work as you possibly can.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this interview. So I guess that is the end.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was super, super fun.
Yeah, of course. I'm gonna stop the recording.